When Mark Weston moved into the quiet neighborhood of Oak Ridge Hills, he imagined backyard barbecues, bike rides with his son, and the peace of a well-kept community. The Homeowners Association had a reputation for being strict, but Mark didn't mind rules, he thought, kept things in order. It was the second summer in their new home when the idea took root. Mark's son Dylan had recently turned 10, and their weekend hikes in the woods always ended with Dylan pointing at a tree and imagining a treehouse perched in its branches. So, Mark did what any hands-on dad would do. He promised they'd build one together. The oak tree at the corner of their lot was tall, wide-limbed, and strong. Over the next few weeks, father and son hauled wood, sanded beams, and drilled together panels under the sun. By the time July rolled around, the treehouse had taken shape. It had a wrap-around balcony, a retractable rope ladder, even a little solar lantern for nighttime reading. Dylan decorated the inside with maps and painted signs. It wasn't just a fort, it was a castle in the sky. Neighbors passing by admired the craftsmanship. One even brought her grandkids to take a look. It became a small attraction, a symbol of childhood dreams built with real effort. Mark felt proud until the letter arrived. It came in a plain white envelope, tucked neatly into the mailbox, bearing the HOA's seal. Inside was a formal notice: unauthorized construction of an elevated structure in violation of community guidelines. Immediate removal requested within 10 days. Mark read it twice. There was no mention of any rule against treehouses in the HOA's welcome packet. He checked again. Nothing. He tried not to overreact. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. So, he took Dylan to school the next morning, then drove straight to the HOA office. The receptionist, tight-lipped, said the president was unavailable, but handed him a copy of the community bylaws. He read them in his car. There were rules against detached structures, sheds, and mobile units, but nothing about treehouses. He underlined the section on non-permanent fixtures and highlighted the clause about family recreational features. It seemed clear. 3 days later, Mark showed up at the monthly HOA meeting, ready to ask questions. The board sat behind a folding table in the community center, sipping coffee and shuffling papers. At the center sat Karen Mullins, HOA president, whose name Mark had heard more than once in conversations involving warnings, fines, or uninvited criticism. When he brought up the treehouse, Karen leaned forward slowly. "It may not be written exactly, but it violates the spirit of our community aesthetic," she said flatly. "We aim for uniformity, and elevated play structures are an eyesore." The room went silent. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off. "You've had your say, Mr. Weston. The letter stands." He returned home with a growing knot in his chest. Dylan was inside the treehouse, reading a comic, oblivious to the storm that was building. Mark climbed the ladder, sat beside him, and stared out at the trees. He could tear it down, keep the peace, accept defeat. But something in him pushed back. The project wasn't just about wood and nails. It was about time spent, memories built, promises kept. The treehouse meant something not just to Dylan, but to him. That night, while putting Dylan to bed, Mark made a quiet vow. He wasn't letting it go, not like this. And somewhere in that silence, an idea began to take shape. Something unexpected. Something that would change everything. If you've ever been told to tear something down that mattered to you, you might want to see what Mark does next. Stick with the story, it only gets more unpredictable from here. The next morning, Mark stood in his backyard with the violation letter in hand. The summer air felt heavier now. He studied the treehouse like it was already halfway gone, picturing the boards coming down, the laughter fading from its walls. Dylan didn't know yet. Mark hadn't told him. Not until he was sure of what to do. By noon, a knock sounded at the front door. It wasn't a neighbor. It was a man in a tan HOA jacket, clipboard in hand, sunglasses hiding any sense of emotion. He introduced himself as Robert from compliance. Mark didn't invite him in. But that didn't stop Robert from stepping onto the porch and eyeing the backyard over Mark's shoulder. "We're following up to see if removal has begun," Robert said, flipping pages on the clipboard. Mark shook his head. "I've reviewed the guidelines. There's no rule against a personal use treehouse." Robert paused, like he'd heard that response before. "It's a matter of interpretation. The board sees it as an unauthorized external structure." "Then, let's talk to the board," Mark replied. "You can submit a formal appeal," Robert said, already walking away. "But I wouldn't wait too long. Non-compliance fees begin next Monday." Mark watched him disappear down the street. There was no warmth, no discussion, just a process, cold and calculated. It wasn't about right or wrong. It was about control. That evening, after Dylan went to sleep, Mark sat down at his computer and began writing. He drafted a letter to the HOA board, citing page numbers, paragraph lines, and even local zoning ordinances. He wasn't a lawyer, but he was thorough, and he had one advantage: he was paying attention now. He emailed it and printed a copy, hand-delivering it to the HOA's mailbox. For a moment, he felt a flicker of momentum. Maybe reason would win out. But the response came the next morning, handwritten, slipped under his front door. The board has reviewed your appeal and determined the structure is not in alignment with Oak Ridge community values. Final notice: remove the structure by Sunday, or fines will be applied daily. The words hit harder this time. Community values. As if joy, creativity, and building something with your child violated some sacred code. Mark drove to the community center. He tried again to meet with Karen. The receptionist avoided his gaze and said she wasn't in. He waited in the parking lot at 3:15. Karen emerged from the side door with a tote bag and a phone pressed to her ear. Mark stepped forward cautiously. She noticed him but didn't stop. He called her name. She waved a hand. The matter's closed. Mr. Weston, it doesn't have to be, he replied. She turned briefly. It already is. Then she got into her car and drove away. Frustrated, Mark returned home. Later that evening, while putting trash out, he noticed something strange near the side. Fence footprints, fresh ones, leading around the corner of the house toward the treehouse ladder. He pulled out his phone and flipped through the security cam. Feed. At 2:47 a.m. the night before, someone in a hooded sweatshirt had walked through the side yard, stopped at the treehouse, taken pictures, then walked back the same way they came. The video wasn't perfect, but it was enough. It wasn't a kid. It was an adult, and the timestamp suggested someone was keeping tabs. He didn't show Dylan. Not yet. But that night, he backed up the footage, double-checked the locks, and started considering that this wasn't just about a treehouse anymore. There was something deeper, and he wasn't backing down. What Mark found next would shift his entire perspective and push him toward a decision no one in Oak Ridge saw coming. If you've ever felt backed into a corner, you'll want to see what happens next. By Friday morning, the tension inside Mark's home had turned into a quiet storm. He hadn't told Dylan anything yet, though the boy was beginning to notice the way his father would glance nervously toward the backyard every time the wind rustled the branches. The joy that once filled their little hideaway in the tree was slowly being swallowed by something colder, uncertainty, and someone watching. Mark pored over the security footage again. The figure in the hoodie had walked with purpose. Not a teenager sneaking around for fun, someone older. Someone who knew exactly where to go and when. He made 3 copies of the footage, 1 digital backup, 1 USB drive, and a third stored on a cloud drive. Just in case. That evening, just before sunset, a knock came at the door again. This time it was Karen herself. No clipboard, no HOA badge, just a folder in her hands and that tight, practiced smile she wore when she wanted something. "May I come in?" she asked. Mark didn't move. "What is this about?" She extended the folder. "Final paperwork. You've had more than enough time to comply. I wanted to deliver it myself as a courtesy." He took the folder without inviting her in. Inside were photos of the treehouse, recent ones. The angles matched what the hooded figure had taken. There were also printed violation slips, daily fine projections, and a final threat. If the structure wasn't removed by Sunday evening, the HOA would initiate legal action to force demolition. "It's a playhouse for my kid," Mark said, his voice low. Karen's tone remained level. This community was designed for harmony, not for personal statements. "It's not about your son, it's about everyone else." Mark stared at her. "You trespassed to take these photos." "I didn't," she said quickly, too quickly. "But someone from compliance has every right to inspect visible violations." He looked at her face, calm, controlled, but he could see the tightness behind her eyes. She was used to people giving in. He wasn't sure anyone had ever pushed back this far before. "Why do you care so much?" he asked. Karen glanced toward the treehouse behind him. "Because if I allow one person to ignore the rules, it becomes chaos. And that's not the kind of neighborhood I built." She left without waiting for a reply. That night, Mark sat in the treehouse alone after Dylan went to bed. He turned off the porch lights, let the darkness cover him. He listened to the sounds, the distant hum of crickets, The creaking of branches in the warm breeze and tried to figure out what he was really fighting for. It wasn't about defiance. It was about something deeper. The way Dylan smiled when he pulled the rope ladder up. The feeling of creating something by hand. The sense of peace this place gave him, even if it was 10 feet off the ground. He pulled out his phone and started browsing short-term rental listings nearby. That's when an idea hit him, not like a joke or a revenge fantasy, but something real, something bold. The HOA wanted it gone because it didn't belong. But what if it suddenly had a legal, functional purpose? He stared at the treehouse floor, already imagining the blueprint in his head. New steps, a better railing, a solar fan. He could file a business license. Make it official. Flip the entire narrative, not tear it down, but turn it into something bigger. He smiled for the first time in days. Some people fold under pressure. Others turn it into opportunity. What Mark did next would not only protect the treehouse, it would flip the entire power dynamic in Oak, and the HOA would never see it coming. Saturday morning brought with it a heavy stillness. Mark could feel it in the way his neighbors avoided eye contact as they walked past his home. The treehouse, once a neighborhood curiosity, now seemed to carry a silent weed-an object of tension. He knew why. The HOA was making calls, drawing lines, turning quiet glances into cold shoulders. Still, Mark kept his head down and got to work. He made a checklist, minor safety upgrades, aesthetic adjustments, and technical documentation. If he was going to convert the treehouse into a legal short-term rental, it had to pass city code. His research uncovered a surprising loophole. Oak Ridge fell under a local ordinance that allowed microstructure rentals under certain square footage, as long as they were reinforced, accessible, and not used as full-time dwellings. The moment he saw it, the path became clear. He didn't tell anyone, not yet, but while screwing in a new solar motion light, his phone buzzed. A message from Janet, the retired widow to houses down. They'd only chatted in passing before, mostly over lawn, tips and trash day confusion. Need to talk. Privately. Curious, Mark walked over. She greeted him on her porch with a look he hadn't seen on her before. Jancy. She's not doing this because of the treehouse, Janet said in a whisper. Karen's pushing this because of the landscaping contract. Mark raised an eyebrow. What landscaping? The one her nephew is bidding for. There's a plan bin floating through the board. Community forest renewal. Fancy name for clearing older trees and putting in decorative ones. Your oak is on that list. Mark blinked. But it's on my property. Doesn't matter, Janet said. If it's within 10 feet of a shared sidewalk or easement, the HOA claims influence. Your treehouse isn't the problem. The tree is. Suddenly, it all made sense. The urgency, the obsession, the midnight photos. Karen wasn't just protecting aesthetic rules. She was clearing a path for a deal, one that brought money or favors close to home. That night, Mark walked the edge of his lot with a flashlight, measuring tape in hand. The oak tree base sat just outside the 10-foot HOA zone. Technically, it was safe. But that wouldn't stop Karen from trying. He went inside and opened his laptop. Then, he began documenting everything. He compiled the original blueprints, the security footage, the violation letters. He started an archive, labeled every folder, because if things escalated and he needed a complete record. While reviewing footage again, he noticed something new. On the night of the trespass, a car had idled across the street with its headlights off for nearly 15 minutes. He zoomed in. It was Karen's sedan. She hadn't just authorized the photo taking, she'd been watching it happen. The thought didn't scare him. It clarified his resolve. By morning, Mark had filed a home business declaration online, created a booking profile draft for a canopy retreat experience, and contacted a local carpenter to add stairs in place of the rope ladder. But he also did something else. He sent an anonymous tip to the county code compliance office, including the tree removal plans circulating in the HOA, not as revenge, as a countermove. Karen wasn't the only one who could play chess. The next day, a city inspector's car appeared on the street. Karen came storming out of her house, waving her hands, her face red. But this time, it wasn't Mark under scrutiny. It was her. As Mark's quiet resistance began turning public, lines were drawn deeper in Oak Ridge, and as one neighbor rose, in defiance, others started wondering, was the HOA president hiding more than just a plan to cut down trees? Mark sat at the kitchen table, staring at the blinking cursor on his laptop screen. His heart raced, not from fear but from anticipation. The city inspector had visited the day before and spoken with Karen for nearly 30 minutes on her lawn. Mark hadn't heard what was said, but he didn't need to. Later that evening, a notice was posted on the community board. The forest renewal project had been postponed indefinitely pending further review. His oak tree was safe for now, but the clock was still ticking on the HOA's threat to demolish the treehouse. Sunday was the deadline. If the structure wasn't down by nightfall, daily fines would begin. Karen hadn't backed off, just shifted tactics. The pressure would continue. Mark knew that, and he knew he needed more than defense, he needed leverage. That's when his wife, Nora, who had been quietly supportive through all of it, made a passing comment that changed everything. You know, she said, sipping coffee while looking out the window toward the treehouse, if they're going to call it a business, why not let it become one? Mark looked up. You're joking. She shook her head. Why not list it on Airbnb? Make it an actual rental. If they want to accuse you of running a business, might as well turn their complaint into a revenue stream. At first it felt like a wild suggestion until he thought about how many people would pay for a weekend in a rustic, elevated hideaway. The neighborhood might call it a nuisance, but to a traveler, it was charm, privacy, novelty. He began drafting a listing. The photos practically made themselves. He took shots of the treehouse at sunrise, with the first light cutting through the leaves and touching the balcony. Inside, he placed a cozy reading chair, a lantern, and a wool blanket. He updated the structure with a mini fan powered by solar panels, a lockable storage box, and even a compact battery-powered sound machine. He titled the listing The Nest at Oak Ridge. The write-up described it as a quiet escape in a leafy suburb, perfect for a solo writer's retreat or a romantic night above the world. He set the price, modestly enough to draw attention. Then, with a deep breath, he clicked publish. He didn't expect the results to come so quickly. The listing received 5 bookmarks in the first hour. 2 inquiries followed, one from a local couple looking for a unique anniversary spot, and another from a traveling photographer on a statewide tour. That night, a booking came through. 3 nights, paid in full. Mark stared at the confirmation email like it was proof of something unspoken, that the fight wasn't just to keep a treehouse, but to reclaim the right to use his own property, without fear. The next morning, he updated his file and sent a notification to the HOA. The treehouse was now an officially registered part-time rental unit compliant with city code and operating under zoning laws applicable to micro-dwellings. He expected pushback. He expected threats, but he didn't expect what arrived in his mailbox that afternoon. A notice from the HOA's legal counsel claiming he was violating the commercial use ban and subject to immediate daily fines exceeding $200. Mark didn't blink. He forwarded the letter straight to a contact he'd made at the county office, attaching the appropriate permits and a time-stamped proof of business license. He knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but for the first time since the battle began. The initiative was his. While the HOA scrambled to shut him down. Strangers from outside the neighborhood were about to arrive, and once they did, the story behind the nest at Oak Ridge would spread far beyond any HOA's control. The first guest arrived on a Thursday afternoon, a writer from out of state who wanted a quiet, natural space to finish her manuscript. Mark met her at the gate, showed her up the newly installed wooden stairs, and handed her a welcome kit with snacks, a lantern, and a laminated map of local walking trails. She loved it instantly. Took photos, posted them online by Friday evening. 2 more bookings rolled in. But what should have felt like a victory only deepened the tension, because while guests were sipping tea and watching birds from the treehouse balcony, Karen was building a new attack. Saturday morning, a thick envelope landed on Mark's doorstep. Inside was an official complaint, this time, not from the but from the local zoning board. The wording was sharp. Someone had submitted a report alleging unauthorized commercial use in a residential zone, an unregistered overnight guest activity. A copy of his Airbnb listing was attached, highlighted, printed, and annotated. Mark stared at the pages. He could practically see Karen's fingerprints all over it. Still, he'd prepared for this. He pulled out his permit records, proof of compliance, even the micro-dwelling clause that permitted temporary stays under 30 days. He'd followed the rules. Every line of them. He submitted his response and CC'd his contact at the county TAD, a zoning specialist who'd been impressed with how cleanly Mark had set everything up. Later that afternoon, Todd called. "We got the complaint," Todd said. "I reviewed your documents. You're fine. They're just trying to bury you in paperwork." Mark laughed softly. That sounds about right. But off the record, Todd added, I've seen this HOA's name pop up a lot lately. You're not the only homeowner they're targeting. The words stuck with Mark. If others were being pressured, harassed, even this wasn't about one treehouse. This was systemic. That evening, Mark returned home to find yellow flyers taped to several fences on his street. They read, Protect our neighborhood, say nitrogen monoxide to commercial rentals in Oak Ridge. No name was listed, but everyone knew who'd made them. Karen had escalated the war from private letters to public shaming, but what she didn't anticipate was the reaction. By Sunday, one of Mark's guests, a travel blogger, posted a glowing review of the treehouse, complete with photos, a drone video, and a heartfelt message about small-town escapes. The post exploded online. Hundreds of likes, dozens of comments asking where they could book it. Oak Ridge wasn't just a quiet suburb anymore, it was trending. Karen doubled down. She issued a community-wide message claiming the Airbnb posed security risks and invited strangers to loiter near children. Mark's mailbox was stuffed with copies of the letter, but by now, some of his neighbors were starting to question her narrative. One resident, Paul, an older man who rarely left his garage, walked up to Mark while he was watering the front lawn. Let me know if she tries to pull anything on you, Paul muttered. She'll find me $500 last year for a wind chime. A wind chime? Others followed quiet nods, whispered support. The fear that Karen thrived on was cracking. Mark didn't retaliate. He didn't need to. The bookings continued. The story kept spreading, and behind the scenes, he was working on something bigger, something Karen wouldn't be able to spin. Stop, or silence. Because what started as a father's gift to his son had now become something else entirely. And as more eyes turned toward Oak Ridge, the question began to shift. How far would one HOA president go to maintain control, even if it meant exposing herself in the process? By Monday morning, Mark's quiet cul-de-sac was no longer just a residential street, it had become the backdrop of a growing online narrative. Dad turns treehouse into Airbnb after HOA threat had appeared as a headline on a local digital news outlet. And within hours, larger platforms picked it up. Commenters debated zoning rights, overreaching HOAs, and whether a treehouse should be considered a business at all. But it was the viral video that truly blew it open. The travel blogger who stayed the previous weekend had posted a short video on social media, 1 minute of slow pans over the treehouse at golden hour. Dylan waving from the balcony, and Mark's own voice narrating part of the story. It ended with the line, Sometimes, the best way to fight rules is to outgrow them. The video exploded. Overnight, the post reached 500,000 views. By the time Mark opened his front door the next morning, 2 news vans were parked at the end of the street. He didn't speak to them at first. But after calls from friends and a polite, respectful approach by a young reporter, he agreed to a short interview. He framed the story as a father's effort to create something special for his son and how quickly it had turned into a battle over power and control. Karen, on the other hand, was far less prepared. By midweek, another reporter knocked on her door. She stepped outside and, perhaps thinking she could still control the story, began speaking. The moment she saw Mark across the street, she raised her voice. He brought strangers into this neighborhood without approval, she snapped. He's profiting off something illegal, and we're taking action. The reporter's camera didn't miss a beat. Karen's tone was sharp, her gestures exaggerated. The clip hit the evening news. Within hours, it had been clipped, reshared, and meme. That was when the tipping point came. 2 members of the HOA board resigned the next day. Quietly, without statement. One neighbor began circulating a petition for Karen's recall, citing misuse of authority, personal conflicts of interest regarding the landscaping contract, and unlawful surveillance of private property. More neighbors signed than Mark expected. But Mark wasn't celebrating yet, because while Karen's power was slipping, she wasn't going quietly. That Friday, Mark received another envelope. This one wasn't from the HOA, came directly from a private legal firm. Karen had retained counsel. The letter alleged that Mark was defaming her publicly and causing reputational damage through unlawful business conduct and online misrepresentation. Mark handed the envelope to his own attorney, a family friend who had been following the story since it went viral. The man chuckled, shook his head, and said, "She's flailing. Let her swing." Then came the call from someone Mark didn't expect. It was a producer from a national morning show. They wanted to fly him and Dylan out for a live segment titled From Backyard Battle to Viral Victory. It would be just a few minutes. a feel-good piece. They'd even donate a scholarship for Dylan as part of the story. Mark hesitated, not because he didn't want the attention, but because he could feel that the climax hadn't hit yet. Something still lingered beneath Karen's calm expression in every public shot. A final card. One last strike. And he was right. Because the night before the interview was set to air, a new development unfolded, one that Karen hadn't anticipated. Mark received a flash drive. No note, no name. But when he opened it, he found audio crackly but clear enough. Karen, speaking at a private board meeting, if we let him win, others will think they can do the same. I don't care what it takes, make that treehouse go away. Even if we have to call in the city under false grounds, no one needs to know. Mark sat back in his chair, stunned. He knew what it meant. The battle was almost over, but the war, that was about to end with a single, undeniable twist. Mark played the audio clip 3 times before he could process what it really was. Not a rumor, not speculation, but a recording, Karen's own voice confirming what he had suspected all along. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was willing to bend the law to maintain control. The clip was clear enough to be undeniable. Karen openly admitting she wanted the treehouse gone, no matter what it took, even if it meant lying to city officials. Mark didn't rush. He took the flash drive, made 2 copies, and called his lawyer. By the next morning, the audio had been reviewed, transcribed, and prepared for a formal complaint. His attorney advised him to submit it through both legal and media channels, not out of revenge but for protection. If she was willing to act outside the law, he needed a spotlight on her. The producer for the national morning show called again. They were still interested in the story, especially with this new twist. Mark agreed, but only after the audio had been turned over to county authorities. He wasn't interested in humiliation. He wanted accountability. That Friday, just before his and Dylan's flight out, an official notice was posted on the HOA community board. Karen Mullins has voluntarily stepped down from her position as HOA president. Effective immediately. No explanation. No press release. Just a sudden, quiet fall from power. Mark heard from a neighbor that she left town shortly after, claiming she needed a health break, but the damage had already been done. The board was being restructured. The treehouse remained untouched. During their trip, Mark and Dylan appeared on the morning show. Dylan beamed as he described the ladder, the lantern, and the secret shelf for comic books. Mark kept the focus on what mattered, how one project meant more than people realized, how building something with your child can become a lasting memory, how systems sometimes overreach, but quiet resistance can hold them back. After the segment aired, the treehouse listing saw an avalanche of new interest. Travelers from across the country requested weekend stays. Bloggers wrote about it. A local artist offered to paint a mural of the treehouse on the side of a nearby library. And yet, despite the attention, Mark kept things simple. He kept bookings spaced out. He didn't expand. He didn't raise prices. Because for him, this wasn't about profit, it was about what he had defended. Months later, something unexpected happened. A certified letter arrived in the mail. Not from a lawyer, from the County Office of Historic Designation. Inside was a formal document granting the treehouse a special designation, noteworthy microstructure of cultural interest. It was a rarely used clause reserved for unique properties that contributed meaningfully to local history and public interest. It didn't mean landmark status, but it meant protection. The treehouse could no longer be forcibly removed by any HOA vote or policy. It was, legally and publicly, permanent. Mark walked into the backyard that evening with Dylan and unfolded the letter for him to read. The boy looked at him, grinning. So, they can't take it down now. Mark smiled. Not even if they tried. They climbed the steps together, the sun just beginning to dip below the trees. From up high, they could see rooftops, birds settling on power lines, and a world that for once felt still. Mark leaned against the wall and looked around the little space they'd built by hand, the same space they'd nearly lost. And he realized something. Sometimes you don't need to win a war loudly. You just have to refuse to give in. If you've ever stood your ground for something that mattered, especially when no one else believed, you should, then you know exactly what this fight was about. Subscribe for more stories that prove a quiet voice, when backed by conviction, can echo louder than 100 rules ever written.